name's Jeff Robinson, and we're continuing the series based on my book, Saved by Grace Through Faith, or Saved by Decree, which is a biblical and theological critique of Calvinism. And today I want to give some consideration to theological implications or some theological issues associated with an alleged doctrine of original sin. In the previous series that I had done, video 4 in that series, where I'd also looked at some theological issues associated with original sin, I looked at what I called the personal accountability principle. This asserts that justice is really only served when an individual is held accountable for his own sins, not for the sins of a previous generation. It would be unjust for God to hold me guilty for the actions of, say, Hitler or whoever. And there are actually, I looked at 3 or 4, and there are many scriptures, relatively quite a few scriptures in the Old Testament especially, that highlight this principle that ancient Israel was not to blame the previous generation for its current sins. Another theological point I'd made in the previous videos, video 4 in that series, was that there's a big problem of connection to Adam. How exactly does Adam's sin connect to me today? And I discussed briefly there three basic views. The seminal headship view, or the seminal view, which says that the effect of Adam's sin, namely inherited guilt and inherited corrupted nature, is transmitted through sexual intercourse. Another view is through federal headship, whereby Adam is considered to be designated mankind's representative, so that when Adam sinned, he represented me sinning. And thirdly, the realist position, which says that I was actually in Adam, so that when Adam sinned, I actually sinned with him and in him. In addition to the fact that there's no biblical warrant for any of these views, there's also they're all fundamentally unjust, basically. And then thirdly, last time I looked at the influence of Augustine on this doctrine. Original sin was unheard of in the church prior to Augustine. For 400 years, the church knew nothing about original sin, essentially. Today I want to look at three other closely related theological issues associated with this doctrine of original sin: infant baptism, the virgin birth, and the Immaculate Conception of Mary. Let's look about infant baptism first of all then. Infant baptism was practiced very early in the life of the church, the early church. But Augustine was essentially the first to appeal to this practice to justify a doctrine of original sin. Here's a quote from the new IVP, New Dictionary of Theology. Augustine was firmly convinced that baptism was indispensable for salvation. In his dispute with Pelagius, he justified the baptism of infants, developing the link between baptism and original sin. Now, Augustine also failed to appreciate that sex is a good gift from God, but rather viewed sex and the sex act as concupiscence, an expression of sinful lust. Here's another quote from my book. The transmission of hereditary sinfulness is bound up with the... No, this isn't a quote from my book. It is, but I'm citing the British historian Henry Chadwick here. The transmission of hereditary sinfulness is bound up with the reproductive process. The general belief that virginity is a higher state than marriage proved for Augustine that the sexual impulse can never be free of some element of concupiscence. In any event, the practice of infant baptism for the remission of sins presupposes that infants arrive polluted by sin. Since they have committed no actual sin, no personal sin, remission must be for the guilt attaching to a fault in their nature. And this idea of original sin and linking it with baptism was codified in the Council of Carthage in 418 AD, in Canon 110. The council declared that anyone who denied the connection between infant baptism and original sin was to be anathematized. However, large segments of Christians today would deny the need for infant baptism, holding only to believers' baptism. Here's a quote from my book. Strictly speaking, if the early church's pronouncements on infant baptism is by definition to be viewed as representing historic Orthodox Christianity, then Christians denying the need for and legitimacy of infant baptism are heretics. No one today would seriously make such a claim. And if the early church can be mistaken on its linkage between salvation and infant baptism, it can also be mistaken on its view of the underlying assumption driving this link, namely original sin. What about the virgin birth? The virgin birth is recorded in the opening chapters of both Matthew and Luke. To many Calvinists, the virgin birth, or more accurately, the virgin conception, of Jesus provides a rationale for original sin. Wayne Grudem again makes that point. Quote, "The virgin birth also makes possible Christ's true humanity without inherited sin. All human beings have inherited legal guilt and a corrupt human nature from their first father, Adam. But the fact that Jesus did not have a human father means that the line of descent from Adam is partially interrupted. And this helps us to understand why the legal guilt and moral corruption that belongs to all other human beings did not belong to Christ." I'll make two observations very briefly. The first is that there is not a hint of connection to original sin as a rationale for the virgin birth in the passages. This is not there. There's no connection, no hint, no allusion, nothing to original sin being the cause or the reason for the virgin birth in either the Matthew 1 or the Luke 1 account of Jesus' birth. Secondly, both passages connect the virgin birth rather to Jesus being uniquely qualified to be the saviour of mankind. Matthew does that in verse 21 of the first chapter of his Gospel. "You shall call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins." Jesus' very name is bound up with his salvific work. And Luke 1:31 says, "He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High," an indirect reference to his deity. So his salvific work, his deity, is what the virgin birth is about, according to the Gospel writers. So in sum, the virgin birth points to one uniquely qualified to bring salvation, because he is God in the flesh. This has nothing to do with the notion of original sin. Thirdly, the Immaculate Conception of Mary. The early church was very much influenced by Augustine, and Augustine was the first to systematically develop a notion of original sin. For the first 400 years of the church's life, the church knew nothing of original sin, which is quite remarkable if it's truly a biblical doctrine. Under Augustine's influence and his emphasis on original sin, it would only be a matter of time before the Roman Church would take the next logical step and explicitly, quote, protect Jesus from the stain of original sin by postulating that Mary herself was also born sinless. As the Catholic Encyclopedia states, quote, "In the Constitution Ineffabilis Deus of 8th of December 1854, Pius IX pronounced and defined that the Blessed Virgin Mary, in the first instance of her conception, by a singular privilege and grace granted by God, in view of the merits of Jesus Christ, the Saviour of the human race, was preserved exempt from all stain of original sin." The Protestant Church has rightly rejected such notions, but the logic holds. If original sin is a reality, then Jesus' sinless status is indeed bolstered if Mary herself is viewed as sinless. This, it seems to me, is a classic case of one theological error, original sin, leading almost inevitably to a subsequent theological error, Mary's Immaculate Conception. A brief video today. Again, the links below, take a look at them. The link to my book in Amazon, the link to the interview that I had with Leighton Flowers in Soteriology 101, and the review of my book by Sean Wilson. I think you'll like them. In the next video, we'll look at some biblical passages that allegedly support a total depravity as understood and defined by Calvinism. Until then, bye for now.